for today, there seemed to be a common theme going on, which is basically this: having a lot of stuff is not important and won't save you or make you happy. There was a selection from Ecclesiastes in which Solomon says everything that we think is important is actually quite pointless. There was a hilarious reading from one of the Psalms in which the psalmist says that rich people are clueless. There was also a reading from Luke that included the parable of the rich fool, which was the subject of Pastor Russell's sermon last Sunday. And then there was a reading from Paul's letter to the Colossian Christians, which didn't seem to fit in with the rest. It was hard to figure out at first what the danger of false teachers and heretics had to do with the danger of acquisitiveness. Just what was the connection? Paul wrote his letter to the church at Colossae to address a growing problem, which he sometimes referred to as the infiltration of false teachings. And in the church that I grew up in, the word false teachers was bandied about quite a bit. The people who were doing the false teaching in the first century church weren't telling the church members anything particularly new and different. These were commonly held beliefs in the Greco-Roman world. And their intentions were not to supersede the gospel, but in Paul's eyes it was heresy because those ideas had no place in the church, and that's why he called them false teachers. Paul felt that they were trying to enthrall the Colossian Christians with their elaborate and obscure ideas. Don't let these people rob you of the prize, he told them. In that society, and in that time period, and in that geographical location, a person who converted to Christianity had to make a pretty radical change. It meant no longer believing in cosmic powers and mythologies and controlling fates and mystic visions. Accepting the teachings of Jesus meant that one had to embrace something that at first seemed inadequately simple. How could something that simple bring fulfillment or salvation? The Greek-influenced belief was that an idea had to be complex in order to have value. To the rest of that society, Christianity looked ridiculous. And it was a challenge for the newly converted Colossians to remain faithful. They were under a lot of pressure. They had begun to worry that perhaps this new gospel wasn't adequate after all. Paul wrote to them to assure them that it was adequate and that they could be confident in its simplicity. Although one may not agree with everything Paul says in his letter to the Colossians, and I don't, its main purpose is one of assurance. Which brings us to our gospel reading from Luke. I'm actually reading from verses 22 through 31, not what it says in the bulletin, and I forgot to tell them to correct it. I'm also reading from the Common English Bible, which is a modern translation, so it may sound a little different from what you're used to. We know from last week that a huge crowd of people had gathered to listen to Jesus, when all of a sudden someone shouted out, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, if you were paying attention to Bill Russell last week, you already know what happened. Jesus taught the crowd about greed using the parable of the rich fool. But after telling them this parable, Jesus did something curious. He turned his attention directly to his disciples and addressed them. At this point, you would think that he would begin an expanded explanation of the parable, something along the lines of hoarding your riches and not being generous and not thanking God. But instead, he began talking about something else. He began to talk about worrying. And this is the reading from the Gospel. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore, I say to you, don't worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. There is more to life than food, and more to the body than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither plant nor harvest. They have no silo or barn, yet God feeds them. You are worth so much more than birds. Who among you, by worrying, can add a single moment to your life? If you can't do such a small thing, why worry about the rest? Notice how the lilies grow. They don't wear themselves out with work, and they don't spin cloth. But I say to you that even Solomon, in all his splendor, wasn't dressed like one of these. If God dresses the grass in the field so beautifully, even though it's alive today, and tomorrow it's thrown into the furnace, how much more will God do for you, you people of weak faith? Don't chase after what you will eat and what you will drink. Stop worrying. All the nations of the world long for these things. Your Father knows that you need them. Instead, desire his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well." May God bless the reading of the Gospel. Now, except for maybe Matthew, who had a government job, most of the disciples were pretty low on the economic ladder. In fact, everybody in Jesus' audience at that time was probably pretty low on the economic ladder. The parable of the rich fool might have been met by them with the same attitude some of us have. I'll never be rich, so that doesn't apply to me. But the rich man and the disciples did have one thing in common, as we all do. The rich man worried about what he was going to do with all of his stuff, and the disciples, along with most of Jesus' audience, worried about where they were going to get stuff. Where would their food, clothing, and shelter come from? Jesus told his disciples to stop worrying about such things because you can't add 1 minute to your life by worrying about it, he said. And today, of course, they tell us that worrying will knock minutes off of your life. It's no secret that we live in a materialistic society. We're bombarded every day by advertising media from which there is no escape. You can't watch 15 minutes of television or look up anything on the internet without being made aware that our society has embraced certain ideals that hardly anyone can attain, but we should all spend all of our money trying to attain those ideals anyway. After all, success is measured by how good looking you are and how much stuff you have. Successful people are thin and beautiful. Successful people drive Mercedes cars with leather seats and wear designer clothes. Successful people have all the latest electronic communication devices, and their homes are large and airy with hundreds of square feet of wasted space. A few years ago, I heard an expert say that it wasn't until the latter part of the 19th century that Americans began to seek happiness. Prior to that time, happiness was equated with being gleeful, and it was much more important to be content than it was to be gleeful, because gleefulness was only transitory, whereas contentment was unwavering. But then the economy changed. We became urbanized. In our current society, we seem to have dispensed with the word contentment. It's more important to be happy. And the way to obtain happiness is to have everything that will make you happy. We think that we need to be in a constant state of euphoria, which is caused by having everything that we want and think we deserve. The advertising media would have you believe that you should have all these things because you are worth it, even if you haven't done anything to be worthy of it. A sense of entitlement has permeated our society and infected more than one generation. Self-esteem has taken the place of self-respect. To be content with what you have is considered to be a weakness of character. And so, like the first century Colossians, we too are under a lot of pressure to conform to what our society says is valuable. We can't all run off into the woods and live on berries and wear leaves and stuff. So how do we deal with this pressure? How does one live without worry in a world that places such a high standard on acquiring wealth? How do we keep from getting caught up in it, from being enthralled by 21st century false teachers? Jesus told his disciples that there was more to life than chasing after stuff. His illustration of how God provided for the grass and flowers was meant to show them that they could trust God. Jesus didn't mean, of course, that the disciples should become irresponsible slackers and just sit back and wait for food and clothing to fall in their laps. They still had to get in their boats and fish, and they did. He meant for them to work, to do the best they could, and trust in God while doing it. Jesus' words to his disciples are meant for us too. We also have to learn to trust God in this materialistic world. But how? Dr. Kenneth Boa says that our trust in God is often dependent on who we think God is. He says, our quality of life will always rise and fall on our view of God and our expectations of him. Once we come to know God as the faithful Father he is, worry simply does not make sense. Wouldn't that be lovely? If only it were that simple. If only we could just read something inspirational, or hear a prayer, or see a butterfly, and come to understand the love of the Father and come to trust him. Dr. Boa goes on to say that believers in Christ will not be exempt from the usual troubles of this world, and that worry-free does not mean trouble-free. Oh shoot, I want the world. I want life to be trouble-free. Don't you? Everybody does. If life was trouble-free, trusting God would be easy. But, as Dr. Boa says, trust in God is not conditional. It's not based on what we think God can or will do for us in a tangible way. We have to find a deeper level of trusting God, one that is not based on what I call bumper sticker theology. I know you've seen it on the back of someone's car, the one that says, "Let go and let God," which implies that we have no responsibility in working out our own problems, that we are helpless and should let God work everything out for us. And then there is that other saying, God will never give you more than you can handle, which some people think comes directly from the lips of Jesus. How often have we seen a person go up to someone in the throes of despair and pat them on the arm saying, God will not give you more than you can handle? The problem with this statement, aside from being misquoted and taken out of context, is that it implies that God is the one who gave you the problems in the first place. But he only gives a person so much, sort of like being tortured, until you almost reach the breaking point. What a comfort. Does that sound like the kind of God you want to trust in? Of course not. One year at Bethany Hills Camp, I participated in one of those trust exercises that camp